The little black girl told the biker she saw a stranger drag someone behind the service passage at level B2. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was a normal evening at the local biker bar. The smell of fried food mixed with the familiar scent of leather jackets and the faint echo of motorcycle engines revving in the parking lot. The place was bustling with laughter and conversation, the usual Friday night crowd enjoying a break from the routine of their lives. But then, the door slammed open, and in came a little girl, no older than 9, her braids bouncing with each frantic step she took. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. She darted straight towards the back booth where a group of bikers were gathered. Her voice, shaking with fear, broke through the noise of the bar. Please help. I saw a stranger dragging someone behind the service passage at level B2. You have to stop him. The bikers froze. A moment of silence passed, and then one by one, their eyes narrowed. They'd seen plenty in their years on the road, but nothing like this. The girl, gasping for breath, looked around the room, her small hands gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her story was incoherent, filled with stammered sentences and panic, but the bikers could make out the most important details: a stranger, a kidnapping, and a service passage leading somewhere dark, somewhere hidden. Jack Forge, the leader of the Iron Wolves motorcycle club, stood up first. His leather jacket creaked as he moved toward the girl. His face, weathered by years on the road, softened as he knelt down to her level. Hey there, kid. It's gonna be okay. We're gonna help you, he said in a voice that was surprisingly gentle, considering the hardened man he was. The little girl looked at him with wide eyes, hope flickering in her gaze. I tried to stop him, but he was too strong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's mind raced as he stood up, turning to his club members. His decision was already made. We're going after him, he said, his voice low and steady. Get the bikes ready. We ride now. The room exploded into motion. The bikers, who were once relaxed and chatting, now moved with purpose. They grabbed their jackets, their keys, and their helmets, not needing any further explanation. For them, this wasn't just a bar fight or a dispute over territory. This was something else entirely. This was about a promise, about loyalty to those who needed them most. Jack turned to the girl one last time before walking toward the door. Stay here, we'll be back, he said, his tone firm. As the bikers filed out of the bar and into the parking lot, the sound of engines revving echoed through the night air. The convoy of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the streetlights, began to roll down the road, heading for the service passage the little girl had mentioned. Jack's mind was focused. A stranger dragging someone. This wasn't just an ordinary call for help. There was something sinister behind it. And the Iron Wolves weren't the type of men who let that kind of thing slide. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, and the stakes were higher than ever. But there was one thing Jack knew for certain. They weren't going to stop until they had answers. The engines roared louder, cutting through the night as they made their way to level B2. As the motorcycles roared down the empty highway, Jack Forge, leader of the Iron Wolves motorcycle club, kept his focus on the road ahead. The night air was cool against his face as he sped through the streets, the headlights of the convoy cutting through the darkness like a line of fire. His mind raced with the images of the terrified little girl and the words she'd spoken. They took my brother. His jaw tightened. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right with him. Why would someone be dragging a kid, or anyone for that matter, behind a service passage? And why the urgency to act now? Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, making sure his club members were keeping up. They were a solid group, used to long rides and dangerous situations. Every man and woman in the pack was a brother or sister, bound not by blood but by loyalty and trust. But tonight, that bond was going to be tested. The convoy reached the industrial district just outside the city, where the towering buildings cast long shadows under the moonlight. The streets here were quieter, with fewer lights and even fewer people. As they approached the service entrance the little girl had pointed out, Jack slowed his bike and gave a hand signal to the others. They came to a stop in front of a large, run-down building. The air was thick with tension, the only sound being the hum of the bike sidling. Jack's mind was running through possibilities. It wasn't unusual for a place like this to have trouble, but a kidnapping? That was something else entirely. Keep your eyes peeled, Jack said to his closest members, Bear and Wrench, as they dismounted from their bikes. We don't know who or what we're dealing with here. Bear nodded, his massive frame towering over the others as he surveyed the area. Wrench, a former mechanic, scanned the ground for any signs of a struggle. The building's entrance was a wide metal door, mostly covered by grime and graffiti, and the only light came from the dim glow of a single streetlight a few yards away. Jack motioned for them to move in. Slowly, they approached the door, their boots echoing softly on the cracked pavement. As they neared, Jack's instincts kicked in. Something felt off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He stopped in front of the door, holding up his hand for the others to stop. Wait, he whispered. He listened carefully, his ears straining against the sounds of the night. The faintest sound reached his ears, scratching, followed by a soft thud. The sound was coming from behind the door. Jack signaled to the group to get ready. They surrounded the entrance, each member of the Iron Wolves in position. Jack reached for the door handle and twisted it gently. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway leading further into the building. The air was thick, damp, and smelled faintly of rust. They moved cautiously, their boots barely making a sound. Jack took the lead, his hand on the grip of his motorcycle helmet, ready for whatever was behind that door. The sound of scratching grew louder as they moved deeper into the building, along with a new sound, faint whimpering. It was coming from ahead. They quickened their pace, rounding a corner to find a small, service room with a single, flickering light overhead. And there, lying on the floor, was a young boy, no older than 8, his clothes torn and covered in dirt. His eyes were wide with terror, but he didn't move. In the corner, a tall man was standing, his back turned to them, seemingly unaware of their presence. The stranger, dressed in dark clothes, was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Jack's eyes narrowed. The man was focused on the boy, but not in a way that felt right. This wasn't some casual kidnapping. It was something far more sinister. Don't move, Jack said in a low, calm voice, his words cutting through the tense air. The man stopped dead in his tracks, his head snapping toward Jack. His eyes widened in surprise as the bikers emerged from the shadows. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the stranger lunged, pulling something from his jacket, a knife. Without hesitation, Bear charged forward, his massive body slamming into the man, knocking the knife from his hand. Jack stepped forward, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Who are you? Jack growled, his voice a low growl of fury. The man struggled, but Jack's grip tightened. Answer me, Jack demanded, his eyes burning with intensity. The man's face twisted into a sneer, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stared defiantly into Jack's eyes, unwilling to give up his secrets. I'm not asking again, Jack said coldly. You'll regret it. The biker club formed a circle around the man, making sure there was no escape. The boy on the floor was still shaking, but his whimpering had stopped. His eyes were wide with fear, but also with hope. He'd seen the bikers come for him, and now he knew they were here to help. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whatever this man was involved in, it wasn't over. There was something bigger at play here, something darker. As he looked at the boy, who was finally beginning to stand, Jack knew one thing for sure. They had just stepped into something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. The Iron Wolves weren't just here to rescue a child. They were about to uncover a web of deceit that would lead them into a world they had never expected. The man's eyes flickered with fear as Jack held him up against the wall. He struggled against Jack's grip, but the biker's strength was undeniable. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged, yet he remained silent, refusing to reveal anything. Jack's patience was wearing thin, and as he glanced back at the boy on the floor, he knew the time for questions had passed. The boy's name was Marcus, and he was trembling with a mix of fear and hope. His wide eyes followed every movement, and Jack could see that he was struggling to make sense of the chaotic scene unfolding before him. Jack's grip tightened. Who are you working for? he demanded again, his voice sharp. This time, the man winced, but still, he said nothing. You're not leaving here until we know what's going on, Jack growled, his voice low and menacing. Bear stepped forward, his huge frame looming over the man. You're in deep, aren't you? Bear said, his tone cold and calculating. The man's eyes darted nervously between Jack and Bear, but the biker didn't relent. Jack could feel the tension building, like the moment before a storm. They had to move quickly, but the situation was more complicated than they realized. As Jack let go of the man's collar, the biker's hand tightened around the stranger's wrist, forcing him to the ground. The man let out a grunt as his knees hit the cold floor. You're going to talk, Jack said, kneeling down to his level. Tell me everything you know, or we can make this a lot harder for you. The man's lips trembled as he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to do it, they made me. He paused, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Who made you? Jack pressed, his patience nearing its breaking point. The man swallowed hard, his chest heaving with every breath. The Serpents, they were behind it. He mumbled, his words barely audible. The Serpents, Jack repeated, his eyebrows furrowing. What do they want with a kid? The man's gaze dropped to the floor, and he shook his head. I don't know. They wanted to use him for something bad. I thought it was a one-time thing, but they kept pushing. Jack's mind raced as he processed the information. The Serpents, a notorious gang known for their ruthless tactics and illegal dealings. He'd heard of them before, but to know they were involved in something this sickening? It made his blood boil. Jack stood up and motioned for his crew to gather around. The wheels were turning, and the stakes had just been raised. They were no longer dealing with a random kidnapping. This was part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. We need to move, Jack said, his voice calm but urgent. The longer we stay here, the more chances they have to make a move. The group nodded in agreement, each member knowing exactly what had to be done. Get Marcus to safety, Jack ordered. We'll deal with this. Bear and Wrench took Marcus by the arms, guiding him gently out of the room while the rest of the bikers prepared for what came next. Jack turned back to the man on the floor. You're going to help us, whether you like it or not, Jack said, his tone hardening. If you want to walk out of here with any chance of survival, you're going to tell us everything. The man nodded, tears streaming down his face. They'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill me if I don't, he stammered. You think we care about that? Jack shot back. You're in the middle of this mess, and it's up to you whether you walk away alive. We're here to help the kid. If you want to save yourself, you'll tell us what we need to know. The man hesitated, his eyes shifting between Jack and the exit. He was a broken man, caught between two forces, the bikers and the gang that had dragged him into this mess. The Serpents, they've got a hideout near the old docks, he said, his voice trembling. That's where they take the kids. They've been using them for some kind of ritual. I don't know what it is, but they've been doing it for months. And now Marcus, the words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jack clenched his fists. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping anymore. This was a sick, twisted operation that needed to be stopped. And the Serpents were behind it all. Jack turned to his crew, his voice low but steady. We're going to the docks. And we're not leaving until we shut this down. As they headed for the door, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far darker than they could imagine. But there was no turning back now. They had a promise to keep, and they would do whatever it took to protect the innocent. The sound of the engines roared to life again, but this time, it was different. This was no longer just a ride for justice. This was a ride for survival. As the bikers hit the road, heading toward the old docks, Jack's thoughts were fixed on one thing. Whatever the Serpents had planned, they were about to find out just how far the Iron Wolves were willing to go to stop them. The Iron Wolves motorcycle club roared through the night, their engines cutting through the silence like a thunderstorm on the horizon. The old docks were just a few miles away, and Jack could feel the tension rising in his chest with each passing second. His mind raced with thoughts of Marcus, the boy they had just rescued, and the dark secrets the Serpents were hiding. The bikers' headlights flickered across the winding road, casting long shadows in the darkness. The smell of salt water from the docks began to mix with the scent of motor oil and leather as they neared their destination. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars of his motorcycle. There was something about the docks that felt wrong, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As they approached the entrance to the abandoned warehouse district, Bear, Wrench, and the rest of the club fell into formation, flanking Jack on either side. "Stay sharp," Jack called out over the radio. "We don't know what we're walking into." The dark, deserted streets felt like a ghost town. Broken streetlights flickered above them, and the windows of the old warehouses were covered in grime, their metal doors rusted shut. Jack could hear the distant sound of waves crashing against the pier, but everything else was eerily silent. The group pulled up to the entrance of the largest warehouse, a decaying structure with graffiti-covered walls and shattered windows. The silence was suffocating as Jack motioned for the bikers to dismount. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they moved into position, their leather jackets blending into the shadows. "We keep this quiet," Jack whispered. "No guns unless we have to. We're here for Marcus. We're here for the truth." Bear and Wrench took the front, moving carefully as they scouted the area. Jack and the rest of the club followed closely behind, their eyes scanning every corner for any signs of movement. The tension in the air was palpable. "This place gives me the creeps," Wrench muttered, his eyes darting around. "Something doesn't feel right." "Stay focused," Jack replied, his voice steady. The team moved like a well-oiled machine, each biker knowing their role, each step taken in silence. As they crept closer to the entrance of the warehouse, Jack noticed the faintest glow coming from inside. It was a low, flickering light, the kind you would expect from an old generator. His gut twisted with unease. He motioned for Bear to move in first. Bear, the biggest of the bikers, moved silently, his massive frame blending into the shadows. He crouched low to the ground and slowly eased the door open just enough to peek inside. The sound of voices reached them, but it wasn't the chaotic noise of a gang. It was controlled, calm, too calm. Jack's pulse quickened as he signaled for the rest of the group to follow. They entered the warehouse slowly, careful not to make a sound. The interior was as grim as the outside. Rusted metal beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and the floors were covered in dirt and debris. In the distance, near the back of the room, Jack could make out the silhouette of several figures standing in front of a dimly lit table. "Stay here," Jack whispered to the group. He crept forward, moving as quietly as possible. The voices grew clearer, and Jack's heart skipped a beat when he recognized one of them. It was the voice of the man who had been with Marcus, the one who had tried to drag the boy away earlier. Jack's eyes narrowed in fury. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Jack peeked around the corner, his eyes locking onto the group. There were 5 men, all wearing the same symbol on their jackets, the mark of the Serpents. They stood in a circle, the dim light casting long shadows on their faces. In the middle of the room was a table, and on it, there were strange objects scattered about, symbols Jack didn't recognize, old books, and several black candles that had been lit in a ritualistic manner. As Jack's eyes scanned the room, they stopped on something that made his blood run cold. Across the room, chained to a post, was a figure. It was hard to make out the details in the dim light, but Jack could tell it was a person. He was no longer looking for answers. He was looking for a fight. The Serpents were not just involved in some petty crime. This was something much darker. They were running a twisted operation, and it had to be stopped. "We're moving in," Jack ordered softly into the radio. The rest of the club began to move into position, weapons at the ready. They had to act fast. Jack's fingers itched to grab his gun, but he knew that wasn't the way. They had to stop this quietly. Bear moved to the front, his massive hands ready to take on whatever came their way. As the bikers advanced toward the center of the room, one of the Serpents looked up, his eyes widening in shock. "What the hell?" he hissed, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. But before he could react, Jack lunged forward, knocking the weapon out of his hand. The fight erupted in an instant. Fists flew, and the warehouse was filled with the sound of punches landing and bodies crashing against metal. But amidst the chaos, Jack's focus remained on one thing, the person chained to the post. As the last of the Serpents fell to the ground, Jack rushed toward the captive. His heart pounded as he saw Marcus's brother, barely conscious, his eyes glazed over. "We're getting you out of here," Jack said softly, his voice filled with determination. The bikers moved quickly, cutting the chains that bound the boy. As they freed him, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Serpents had more plans that went beyond anything they had imagined. But one thing was certain. They would stop at nothing to protect the innocent, and take down anyone who stood in their way. The air was thick with tension as the bikers quickly regrouped. Outside the warehouse, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. They had just freed Marcus's brother, but the job was far from done. The Serpents were not just criminals. They were a well-organized, dangerous gang, and Jack knew this was just a small piece of the puzzle. As Jack looked around at his brothers and sisters in arms, he couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The fight inside had been swift, but they had only uncovered a fraction of what was really going on. There was something bigger, something much darker, lurking behind the walls of that warehouse. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We've got to get out before more of them show up." The bikers moved quickly, loading Marcus's brother onto one of the bikes, and they took off into the night. The sound of roaring engines filled the air, the convoy speeding down the winding streets, leaving the warehouse behind. Jack's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the next move. Where were the Serpents hiding? What was their ultimate plan? The tension in the air grew thicker as they crossed the city limits and headed into the countryside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the road ahead. As they turned onto a desolate highway, Jack's thoughts turned to Marcus. The boy was safe, for now, but how many other children had been taken by these monsters? How many more were being used for whatever sick operation the Serpents were running? Jack's knuckles tightened around the handlebars of his bike, his grip white-knuckled in frustration. He'd made a promise to Tyrone, Marcus's father, to protect his kids, and he wasn't about to let that promise slip away. "We need to find the Serpents," Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of his motorcycle. "We need to put an end to this, once and for all." The convoy sped through the darkened countryside, the only sound the steady rumble of the engines. Jack's mind raced as they neared the edge of town. He needed to know who the Serpents were working with, how deep their network ran. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. The Serpents weren't some petty street gang. They were organized, dangerous, and willing to do whatever it took to stay in control. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when Bear's voice came through the radio. "We've got company," Bear said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "A few bikes are tailing us." Jack glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he saw the headlights in the distance. They were closing in fast. "Stay tight," Jack ordered. "We're not letting anyone get too close. If they make a move, we deal with it." The bikers quickly adjusted their formation, spreading out just enough to cover each other without leaving any gaps. Jack's mind was focused now. If the Serpents had sent people after them, it meant they were getting closer to the truth. The convoy kept moving, but the threat of being ambushed hung in the air like a storm cloud. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As the bikes neared a sharp turn, Jack glanced in his mirror again. The bikes tailing them were getting closer, too close for comfort. "Now," Jack shouted, signaling the group to split up. The convoy scattered, the bikers speeding off in different directions, forcing the pursuers to choose which one to follow. Jack led the pack, his bike roaring down the road as he took a sharp turn, skidding onto a side street. He could hear the sound of tires screeching behind him as the Serpents made their move. They had fallen into the trap. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he weaved through the streets, making quick turns and sharp stops to throw off his pursuers. The alleyways were narrow, and he used them to his advantage, knowing the Serpents wouldn't be able to follow without losing precious time. He could hear the sounds of engines behind him, but they were getting fainter with each turn. The other bikers were executing the same strategy, making it harder for their pursuers to track them down. Jack slowed down as he reached a deserted parking lot, pulling his bike to a stop. The rest of the bikers regrouped quickly, their faces tense but determined. "We lost them," Bear said, nodding in approval. "But they won't be gone for long. They'll circle back." Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surroundings. The chase was over, for now, but the real battle was just beginning. "We need to find their headquarters," Jack said, his voice calm but intense. "We need to know where they're hiding, and we need to make sure Marcus and the other kids stay safe." The group nodded, the weight of their task heavy on their shoulders. But Jack could see the fire in their eyes. This was their mission now, and they were going to finish it, no matter the cost. As the night stretched on, Jack's mind raced with the possibility of what lay ahead. The Serpents had taken too much from them already, and it was time to put an end to it. They would hunt down the gang and tear down their operation, piece by piece. But there was one thing Jack knew. He wasn't alone in this fight. The Iron Wolves would see it through, together. And together, they would protect the innocent and take down anyone who threatened their family. The night was still, too still, as the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club regrouped in the abandoned parking lot. The sound of their engines had long faded, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched across the empty streets. Jack stood at the front, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed his crew. His mind was racing. He knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The Serpents were out there, and they would stop at nothing to get to them. They were being hunted now, not just by the Serpents, but by whoever was pulling the strings in the shadows. "We need to get to their hideout," Jack said, breaking the silence. "This has gone too far. They're not just running some small-time operation. They're organizing something bigger, and we need to find out what it is." The group nodded, understanding the gravity of what was at stake. Jack's voice had that familiar edge, serious, calculated, and full of determination. "We've got to move fast," Jack continued. "Bear, you and Wrench take the back roads. We can't afford to get caught in the open. The rest of us will keep a low profile on the main roads. Let's make sure we don't draw too much attention." As the bikers started their engines again, Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was no longer just about saving one child. It was about stopping a network of criminals who had been pulling strings for far too long. The convoy sped through the streets, their headlights casting long shadows across the quiet town. Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting to the warehouse and the chilling images of the strange ritualistic symbols they'd seen inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much darker than they'd anticipated. They drove for what felt like hours, the sound of their bikes echoing in the empty night, until they finally reached the outskirts of the city. The area was industrial, filled with old warehouses and factories that had long since been abandoned. Jack's gut tightened as they neared a large building at the end of a narrow alley. It was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the windows, as if someone was still inside. Jack signaled for the convoy to slow down. They stopped just out of sight of the building, their bikes idling in the shadows. "This is it," Jack said quietly, glancing over at Bear and Wrench, who had already dismounted. "Stay sharp. This could be it, the Serpents' headquarters." The rest of the bikers dismounted and quietly approached the building, using the cover of darkness to conceal their movements. Jack led the way, his senses heightened as he crept through the alley. The building loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls reflecting the pale moonlight. The air smelled stale, filled with the scent of damp concrete and decay. As they reached the entrance, Jack's heart raced. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip through. They entered the building one by one, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the room. In the distance, Jack could see a large group of people gathered around a table, their faces obscured by the low light. "Stay low," Jack whispered, signaling for the group to spread out. As they moved deeper into the building, Jack's eyes narrowed. The people at the table were speaking in hushed tones, and their words sent a chill down his spine. "We need to make sure the kids are ready for the next phase," one of them said, his voice cold and calculating. "The ritual is almost complete." Jack's blood ran cold. Ritual? What the hell were they talking about? Jack motioned for his crew to move closer. They had to get answers, and they had to get them now. The bikers moved in closer, positioning themselves in the shadows as they crept toward the table. Jack could see more clearly now. There were at least 10 people gathered around the table, all wearing the Serpent's signature logo. They were armed, but they didn't seem to notice the bikers moving closer. Jack's mind raced as he listened to their conversation. They were talking about some sort of ritual, something involving children. "This is it," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to stop them before it's too late." The bikers nodded, understanding the urgency. They couldn't let the Serpents carry out whatever twisted plan they had in motion. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he prepared to make his move. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise on their side. "On my mark," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "We go in fast, take them down hard. No one gets away." The bikers were ready. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger of his gun, but before he could give the signal, the unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed through the building, and the Serpents scattered in all directions. The room was plunged into chaos as Jack's crew rushed in, fists flying and weapons drawn. But amidst the chaos, Jack's eyes locked onto something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the room, the last person he expected to see was there, Marcus's father, Tyrone. Jack froze for a split second. He had known Tyrone, had fought beside him in battles that seemed like a lifetime ago. But seeing him here, in the middle of this madness, was a shock that rocked him to his core. "Tyrone," Jack called out, his voice full of disbelief. Tyrone turned slowly, a look of guilt and sorrow in his eyes. "Jack, I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." The room was filled with the sounds of fists hitting flesh, the clatter of chairs being knocked over, and the frantic footsteps of the serpents scrambling to find cover. But amidst the chaos, Jack's eyes remained locked on one figure in the far corner, Tyrone. His former friend, someone he had trusted, someone he had fought beside in the past, was standing there, looking just as shocked as Jack. Tyrone's eyes were filled with a mix of guilt and regret, and Jack could see the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The fight raged on around them, but Jack couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, still processing the shock of seeing Tyrone here, in the middle of this mess. "Tyrone," Jack called out, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What the hell is going on? Why are you working with them?" Tyrone's face twisted with pain, but he didn't speak right away. His gaze dropped to the floor, as if ashamed to meet Jack's eyes. "Jack," Tyrone finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I didn't want this. I never wanted to get pulled into this mess. But after everything that happened, after what I saw, I didn't have a choice." Jack stepped forward, his voice firm but confused. "What do you mean, didn't have a choice? You were one of us, Tyrone. We fought side by side. What happened to you?" Tyrone's hands clenched at his sides. "You don't understand. After the war, everything changed. I thought I was done with all of this, done with the violence, the chaos. I tried to leave. I tried to get clean. But they wouldn't let me. The Serpents, they have a way of pulling people back in. And they had something on me, something I couldn't escape." Jack's heart sank as he listened. He had known Tyrone for years, had trusted him with his life, but this was something Jack had never imagined. "So you just gave up?" Jack spat, frustration and betrayal evident in his voice. "You let them use you? And now you're helping them hurt kids." Tyrone's eyes finally met Jack's, and Jack could see the pain there. "I didn't have a choice, Jack. I tried to protect them. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. They threatened my family. They made me do it. I had no other way out." Jack stood there for a moment, the weight of Tyrone's words settling heavily on him. He wanted to be angry, wanted to lash out at his old friend for what he had done. But there was something in Tyrone's eyes that made Jack hesitate, something that told him Tyrone hadn't been the one pulling the strings. "Who else is involved, Tyrone?" Jack asked, his voice cold now, filled with determination. "Who else is in this with you?" Tyrone looked around the room nervously, as if afraid someone might hear. "The whole damn operation," Tyrone whispered. "They've got connections everywhere. Police, politicians, even some of the highest ups in the criminal world. They've been using kids for something that goes way beyond anything I ever thought possible." Jack's mind raced as he processed Tyrone's words. This was bigger than they thought. The Serpents weren't just a street gang. They were part of a much larger, more dangerous network. And they were willing to sacrifice anything, even innocent children, to keep their secrets. "We need to take them down, Tyrone," Jack said, his voice hardening with resolve. "This ends tonight. No more hiding behind lies. No more hurting innocent people." Tyrone nodded slowly, the guilt still etched on his face. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not going to be easy. They won't go down without a fight. And I'm not sure we're ready for what's coming next." Jack's eyes hardened as he surveyed the room, his crew still engaged in battle with the remaining Serpents. "We don't need to be ready," Jack said, his voice fierce with conviction. "We've got each other. And that's all we need." With that, Jack turned to the rest of the bikers, signaling for them to regroup. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Serpents had underestimated them, thinking they could control the situation, control people like Tyrone. But they hadn't counted on the Iron Wolves, the family that Jack had built, the loyalty that bound them all together. Jack was ready. The rest of the bikers were ready. And they weren't going to stop until every last one of the Serpents was brought to justice. The group regrouped quickly, their bikes rumbling to life as they prepared for the next phase of their mission. Jack didn't know what awaited them at the docks, but he knew one thing for sure. They were going to put an end to the Serpents' reign of terror. Together, they would fight for the innocent, for the children who had been used as pawns in this sick game. And they would not rest until the Serpents were no more. As the Iron Wolves roared down the road, Jack's thoughts were with the families they had promised to protect, with Tyrone and the choices he had made. The road ahead was dangerous, but Jack knew that they had one thing the Serpents didn't: loyalty and a sense of justice that could never be broken. The night air was thick with tension as the Iron Wolves motorcycle club sped toward the docks. The sounds of their engines roared through the empty streets, each biker's heart pounding in their chest as they neared the final confrontation with the Serpents. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the stakes. They weren't just fighting for Marcus and his brother anymore. They were fighting to take down an entire criminal organization that had been running in the shadows for far too long. The docks loomed ahead, dark and imposing. The moon cast an eerie glow over the massive warehouses, their rusted metal walls reflecting the dim light. As Jack led the convoy into the area, he could see the faint outline of a large building in the distance. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the whole place was holding its breath. "Stay alert," Jack said over the radio, his voice low and focused. "We don't know how many of them are here. This could get ugly fast." The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As they approached the building, Jack noticed something strange. There were no guards at the entrance, no signs of activity. It was almost as if the Serpents were waiting for them. "This is too easy," Bear muttered, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's a trap." Jack didn't respond. He had the same feeling in his gut, but they couldn't afford to hesitate now. They had come this far, and they weren't about to back down. He motioned for the group to spread out, positioning themselves around the perimeter of the building. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and decay, and the sound of the waves crashing against the docks only added to the tension. Jack led the way, his steps silent as he moved toward the entrance. The others followed close behind, their movements coordinated and precise. As they reached the door, Jack paused for a moment, listening carefully. There was no sound from inside, no voices, no movement, nothing. "We're going in," Jack said, his voice steady. Without waiting for a response, he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the still night air. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The only sound was the faint hum of an old generator in the corner. As they stepped into the room, Jack's eyes quickly scanned the area. There was no sign of the Serpents, no sign of anyone at all. "What the hell is going on?" Wrench whispered, his voice filled with confusion. "It's too quiet." Jack didn't answer. He knew the Serpents weren't stupid. They wouldn't leave their hideout unguarded. This had to be a setup. They had been lured into a trap. Just as Jack began to turn back toward the door, the lights flickered, then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the shadows. The bikers froze, their senses heightened. Jack's hand instinctively went to the handle of his gun, but before he could draw it, the sound of laughter filled the room. It was low and mocking, the voice of someone who knew they had the upper hand. "Did you really think you could just waltz in here and take us down?" the voice sneered. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. "Show yourself," he growled. "Who the hell are you?" From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a tall man, dressed in black, with a smug grin on his face. He stepped into the dim light, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I'm the one who's going to end this," the man said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've been chasing shadows, Jack, but now you're in mine." Jack tensed, his heart racing. He didn't recognize the man, but the confidence in his voice told him everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary Serpent. This was someone high up in their organization, someone who knew exactly how to play the game. "What's your plan?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the growing sense of danger. "You think you've won, but you haven't even begun to understand what we're capable of." The man laughed again, a cold, cruel sound. "You're out of your depth, Jack. You're not going to stop us. No one ever does." As he finished speaking, the lights came back on, revealing a group of armed men standing behind him. The Serpents had been waiting for them. This was the trap they had walked into. Jack's grip tightened on his gun, but before he could make a move, the man raised his hand, signaling for his men to hold their fire. "It's over," the man said, his grin widening. "Your little crusade ends here." Jack's mind raced as he surveyed the situation. They were outnumbered, surrounded by enemies with weapons drawn. But the Iron Wolves weren't afraid. They had been through worse, and they had always come out on top. "We're not backing down," Jack said firmly. "Not now, not ever." The tension in the air was palpable as the standoff continued. The Serpents were confident, but Jack could see the fear in their eyes. They knew they had to win this fight, or everything would fall apart. Jack's fingers itched to pull the trigger, but he knew this had to be done right. This was the moment that would decide everything. As the two sides stared each other down, Jack knew the time for talking was over. It was time to end this, once and for all. The tension in the warehouse was unbearable as both sides stood at a standstill, each aware that the next move could change everything. Jack's eyes never left the man at the front of the Serpents group, the man who had so confidently declared their victory. Jack's crew was positioned strategically, the bikers tense, but ready for anything. They had come too far to let fear take hold now. The armed men in front of them, the Serpents' most loyal and dangerous, stood with their weapons at the ready. Their faces were stern, their eyes cold, but Jack could see the smallest flicker of uncertainty in their gazes. They were all bluffing, and Jack knew it. This wasn't just about guns and muscle, it was about survival. It was about the Iron Wolves' loyalty to each other and the promise they'd made to protect the innocent. He could see his brothers in arms behind him, their eyes full of determination. They had been through hell together, and tonight was no different. "You're not going to walk away from this," Jack said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Not tonight. Not after everything you've done." The Serpent leader sneered, stepping forward, his eyes locked onto Jack's with disdain. "You think you're some kind of hero? Some kind of savior? You're nothing but a bunch of fools playing in a game that's way out of your league." Jack's expression hardened, the weight of the moment settling in. The Serpents had underestimated them, just like they had underestimated every other group they had crossed paths with. But Jack wasn't just any group. The Iron Wolves weren't here to play. They were here to finish what they started. "This isn't about playing games," Jack said, his voice firm, unwavering. "This is about stopping you. And we will stop you." Without another word, the Serpent leader raised his hand, signaling his men. In that instant, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out, and the bikers immediately took cover, returning fire with precision. Jack dove behind a stack of crates, his heart racing as the sound of bullets ricocheted off the walls. The fight was on. The Serpents came at them from all sides, their guns blazing, but the Iron Wolves were prepared. They had the advantage of experience, and they knew how to fight in a tight space. Jack's mind was laser-focused as he moved quickly between cover, his gun steady in his hand as he took down one Serpent after another. The chaos was overwhelming, but Jack thrived in it. He had always known how to keep his cool when it mattered most. "Cover me," Jack shouted, signaling for Bear to move up. Bear nodded and charged forward, his massive form a blur of motion as he knocked Serpents aside, clearing the path for Jack. The two of them moved like a well-oiled machine, each move calculated and precise. "We've got this," Bear shouted, his voice full of adrenaline as he knocked another enemy to the ground. The warehouse was now filled with the sound of gunfire, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. But Jack didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when Marcus's family was at risk. Not when innocent lives were on the line. He fought with everything he had. The Serpent leader, seeing his men fall one by one, backed up toward the far end of the room. He was no fool. He knew he couldn't win this fight. But Jack wasn't about to let him escape. "Not so fast," Jack called out, his voice fierce. He moved toward the Serpent leader, his eyes narrowing as he took aim. "You're not going anywhere." The leader looked back at him, fear flashing across his face for the first time. He reached for his own gun, but before he could raise it, Jack shot it out of his hand, sending it clattering to the floor. "Game's over," Jack said, his voice cold, as he stepped forward, grabbing the man by the collar and lifting him off his feet. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." The Serpent leader struggled, but Jack held him firm. "What are you really up to?" Jack demanded, his voice low and deadly. "What's your plan? Who's pulling the strings?" The leader's eyes darted around the room, but Jack could see the fear in his gaze. He wasn't going to last much longer. You don't understand. The leader spat, his voice trembling. This isn't just about money or power. There's something bigger, something none of you can stop. Jack's grip tightened. Who? Who's behind this? The leader smirked, his eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. You'll never know, he sneered. You're all just pawns in a bigger game. Jack's jaw clenched as he threw the leader to the ground. The man was too dangerous to be left alive, but Jack had bigger questions that needed answers. Bear and Wrench had already secured the remaining serpents, their guns trained on them as they kept them from escaping. Jack looked back at his crew. We need to find out who's behind all this, he said, his voice filled with determination. But we're not done yet. The real fight is still ahead of us. The bikers nodded, their resolve hardening. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. As the dust settled and the sound of gunfire died down, Jack took a deep breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They had only just begun to uncover the truth. And no matter what it took, they would finish what they started. The serpents would fall, and the iron wolves would be there to bring them down, one way or another. The sound of sirens in the distance reminded Jack that they didn't have much time. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at the serpent leader, who was still on the floor, his hands bound behind him. The rest of the bikers had the remaining gang members under control, their weapons drawn, but the air was thick with questions that needed answers. Jack's mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened. They had uncovered something massive, something much darker than they could have imagined. But it wasn't over yet. They still needed to know who was pulling the strings, and they needed to put a stop to it before more lives were destroyed. We need to move him, Jack said to Bear, who was standing guard over the restrained serpent members. We can't let him out of our sight. He knows more than he's letting on. Bear nodded and, with a firm grip, helped the leader to his feet, forcing him to walk toward the back of the warehouse. The rest of the bikers followed closely behind, keeping their eyes on the remaining serpents, making sure they wouldn't try anything. As they made their way out of the warehouse, Jack could feel the weight of the situation. They were no longer just dealing with a gang. This was an operation, a well-oiled machine of crime and corruption, and the people behind it were powerful. They had to bring it down before it spread any further. Outside, the night air was cold and damp, but it didn't seem to matter. The tension was too thick to be bothered by anything else. Jack looked at the bikes parked nearby, the engines still humming quietly. They were ready to go, but Jack wasn't about to leave until he had all the answers. Get him on the bike, Jack ordered, his voice calm but demanding. Bear pushed the serpent leader onto one of the bikes, his hands still bound. Jack climbed onto his own motorcycle, his eyes never leaving the man as he revved the engine. We're heading back to the clubhouse. No one talks, no one moves until we have the answers we need. The convoy moved out, their bikes roaring to life as they sped through the empty streets. Jack's mind raced as they made their way back, the sound of the engines filling the silence of the night. They had uncovered the first part of the puzzle, but there was still so much more to learn. They had to find out who else was involved, who was behind the operation, and what their next move was. As they approached the clubhouse, Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about stopping a gang. This was about protecting the people they cared about, the innocent lives that had been caught in the crossfire. The convoy pulled into the parking lot of the clubhouse, the sound of their bikes echoing in the still night. Jack dismounted his bike and walked toward the door, his eyes focused on the leader of the Serpents, who was now struggling against his restraints. You're going to tell me everything, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. And if you don't, we'll make sure you don't walk away from this. The serpent leader sneered, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew Jack meant business. You don't know what you're up against, the man spat, his voice laced with contempt. You're just a bunch of bikers. You think you can take down something this big? You're nothing. Jack leaned in close, his eyes narrowing. I'm not here to play games, he said, his voice a deadly whisper. You either talk, or we make you talk. It's your choice. The leader's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Jack thought he might break. But then, the man's lips curled into a wicked grin. You'll never stop it, he said, his voice filled with bitter amusement. We've got people everywhere. You'll be dead before you even get close. Jack felt a surge of anger, but he controlled it. He couldn't let this man get to him. Not now. Not when they were so close to uncovering everything. Tell me who's behind this, Jack demanded, his voice steady but filled with an edge that made the man flinch. Tell me who's pulling the strings. The serpent leader laughed, a dark, hollow sound that echoed through the room. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said, shaking his head. You think you're ready to take down the real players? You're not even close. Jack clenched his fists, but before he could say anything more, the door to the clubhouse opened, and one of the other bikers stepped inside. Jack, you need to see this, the biker said urgently. Jack nodded and followed the man outside, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the parking lot, was a black SUV, its headlights shining bright in the darkness. The windows were tinted, but Jack could make out two figures inside. He didn't need to be told who they were. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Who are they? Jack asked, his voice tight. We don't know, the biker replied. But they've been following us for the past hour. They know we're here. Jack's mind raced as he looked at the SUV. The Serpents were one thing, but these people? Whoever they were far more dangerous. Get ready, Jack said, his voice filled with resolve. We're not going down without a fight. The convoy quickly prepared for the worst, their weapons at the ready, their eyes focused on the black SUV. This was it. They were walking straight into the lion's den, and they wouldn't leave without answers. Jack's heart raced as he gave the signal to move out. This was the end of the line. The game was on, and there was no turning back. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack's eyes locked onto the black SUV. The figures inside the car were barely visible, but there was no mistaking the threat they posed. The convoy had parked in a strategic formation, their bikes surrounding the SUV, blocking any possible escape route. The hum of the engines filled the air, but there was a dead silence between the bikers, everyone waiting for the next move. Jack's hand rested on the grip of his gun, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had come this far, and now they were staring down the real danger. What do you think? Bear asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. They know we're here. Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving the SUV. He could feel it. Their presence was deliberate, calculated. Whoever was in that car had been following them for a while, and now they were ready to make their move. The problem was, Jack didn't know exactly who they were dealing with. But he did know one thing. It was time to finish this. We approach slowly, Jack said, his voice steady and commanding. No sudden moves. We need answers, and we're getting them. No one fires unless I give the signal. The bikers readied themselves, each member tightening their grip on their weapons. They had been through battles before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher. The Serpents were just the beginning. This was about something bigger, and the players in the SUV could very well be the key to it all. Jack stepped forward, his boots making no sound against the pavement as he moved closer to the SUV. His instincts were screaming at him to be careful, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. Just as he was about to open it, the door swung wide, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. The man was tall, his features sharp, and his expression unreadable. He surveyed the bikers for a moment, his eyes scanning the group before settling on Jack. You're the leader, the man said, his voice calm but cold. Jack Forge, I presume. Jack's hand twitched, but he kept his composure. Who the hell are you? He asked, his voice low, full of menace. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated, and Jack could feel the danger radiating off him. Let's just say I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on you. Someone who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. The man was connected to the Serpents, but he was more than that. He was part of the network they had been trying to uncover. Jack's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, but he kept it holstered for now. You think you can intimidate me? Jack asked, his voice steady, but his mind racing. We've been through worse than this. The man's smile didn't falter. Oh, I'm not here to intimidate you, he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. I'm here to offer you a choice. Walk away now, and we can forget all of this. Keep pushing, and I promise you won't like what happens next. Jack narrowed his eyes. He had heard threats before, but this one felt different. This man wasn't just bluffing. You think I'm going to back down? Jack shot back, his voice full of defiance. Not a chance. You're going down, and we're taking you with us. The man's eyes hardened. Very well, he said, his smile fading into something much darker. But don't say I didn't warn you. With a swift motion, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device. Jack's heart raced as he realized what it was. A detonator. The man had a bomb. What's the plan? Bear asked, his voice low as he kept an eye on the situation. Jack's eyes were locked onto the man's hand, the detonator resting between his fingers. Get back, Jack ordered. Now. But before the man could press the button, the sound of an engine roaring to life interrupted them. Another black SUV screeched around the corner, tires screeching as it came to a stop behind the bikers. The door opened, and two more men stepped out, both armed. I think it's time for you to go, the first man said with a smirk. Jack's eyes darted between the two vehicles. They were surrounded, and the odds were stacking up against them. But the Iron Wolves weren't just going to roll over. Jack's mind raced. He needed a way out, and fast. He signaled to Bear, who immediately moved to position himself behind the second SUV. The bikers knew what to do. They had been through worse situations before. Jack's eyes narrowed as he sized up the man with the detonator. You're not getting away with this, Jack said, his voice filled with venom. We're taking you down, right here, right now. The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. He pressed the button on the detonator, and Jack's heart stopped for a split second. But instead of an explosion, a loud crack echoed through the air. The man's face twisted in shock, and Jack realized that the device had malfunctioned. Without wasting a second, Jack drew his gun, his aim steady as he fired at the man's hand, knocking the detonator from his grip. The bikers moved quickly, closing in on the remaining men and disarming them. It was a swift, well-coordinated attack, and within seconds, the men were on the ground, their weapons taken. The man who had been holding the detonator groaned in pain, his eyes filled with fury. You think you've won? He spat. This is just the beginning. Jack's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. Not anymore. With the Serpents finally neutralized, Jack turned to his crew. We've got them. Let's get the hell out of here. The convoy fired up their engines, ready to leave the chaos behind. But Jack knew this was far from over. They had only just scratched the surface of what the Serpents had planned. The real battle was still ahead. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The air was thick with the sound of roaring engines as the Iron Wolves sped away from the chaos of the docks. Jack's mind was racing, but his body was in autopilot mode. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had won the battle, but there was still so much left to uncover. The Serpents were just the tip of the iceberg, and Jack knew they needed to go deeper to stop whatever dark force was behind it all. He glanced at the rearview mirror, checking to make sure the rest of the crew was still behind him. They had gotten away clean, but that wouldn't last forever. The Serpents had connections everywhere, and there was no way they would let the Iron Wolves get away with this. We need to lay low for a while, Jack said over the radio, his voice firm. Head back to the clubhouse, and don't stop until we're all there. The convoy of bikes followed Jack, their headlights cutting through the night as they rode through the empty streets. As they approached the clubhouse, Jack's mind kept circling back to what they had just uncovered. The Serpents were involved in something much bigger, something dark and twisted. He had seen the fear in the eyes of their leader, the way he had tried to bluff his way out of the situation, but Jack knew better. The man had been hiding something, and Jack was going to make sure he uncovered every last detail. Bear, get the Serpent leader in the back, Jack ordered as they pulled into the clubhouse. We're not done with him yet. Bear, ever the loyal enforcer, nodded and grabbed the man, dragging him into the back room. The rest of the bikers dismounted, their eyes scanning the perimeter. They knew they had to be on alert. What's the plan, Jack? Wrench asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. Jack took a deep breath and looked around at his crew. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This was no longer just about taking down a gang. It was about dismantling a system of corruption that ran deeper than he had ever imagined. We get answers, Jack said, his voice cold and steely. We need to know who's behind all of this. Who's pulling the strings? The Serpents were just the muscle. Whoever's in charge is the real threat. The bikers nodded in agreement, the weight of their mission settling in. They had no time to waste. I'll handle the leader, Jack continued. The rest of you, start looking into the connections. We need to find out who else is involved. This goes beyond just the Serpents. We're dealing with a network, and it's time we tore it down. The bikers spread out, each one taking a specific task. Some went to work digging into the Serpents' history, looking for any trace of the people behind the organization. Others scoured the room, searching for any clues the leader might have left behind. Jack walked into the back room, where Bear was holding the serpent leader. The man was still defiant, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes now. He knew his time was running out. "You're going to talk," Jack said, his voice unwavering as he leaned in close. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, you're going to tell me everything." The man glared at him, his eyes filled with contempt. "You think you can break me? I'm not afraid of you." Jack chuckled darkly. "You should be," he said, stepping closer. "You've got no one left to protect you. Your friends are gone, and now it's just you and me. So let's get to it. Who's behind the Serpents? Who are you working for?" The leader said nothing, but Jack could see the hesitation in his eyes. It was just a matter of time before he cracked. Bear stepped forward, a threatening presence looming over the man. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Bear growled. "Your choice." The man swallowed hard, his face contorting in frustration. He knew they weren't going to back down. With a reluctant sigh, he finally spoke. "You're not going to like it," he muttered. "The Serpents are just a front. There's a bigger organization, a much bigger one. They control everything." Jack's heart raced as he leaned in closer. Who's pulling the strings?" The leader hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if he were considering making a run for it. But he was too far gone. The game was up. "The Syndicate," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been running things for years. The Serpents are just their muscle. They're the ones who orchestrate everything. The deals, the power plays, the underground operations. They own everything." Jack's mind was reeling. The Syndicate. The name sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a gang war anymore. This was a battle against a much larger, more dangerous enemy. He turned to Bear, who was watching the leader carefully. "Get him out of here," Jack said, his voice filled with resolve. "We need to get more information, and we need it fast." As Bear dragged the man away, Jack stood there, his mind racing. The Syndicate was the real threat, and now Jack had a target. He wasn't about to let them continue operating unchecked. The fight had just gotten a whole lot bigger. Jack knew one thing for certain. The Iron Wolves weren't done yet. This was only the beginning. And he was going to take down the Syndicate, piece by piece, no matter what it took. The dawn was breaking as the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club gathered in the parking lot of their clubhouse. The air was cool and heavy, still thick with the lingering tension of the night's events. Jack stood at the front, his face grim, eyes scanning the faces of his crew. They had come a long way, fought hard, and uncovered something that most people would never dare to face. But it wasn't over yet. The Syndicate was still out there, a shadow looming over everything they had worked for. Jack's mind was focused, his thoughts sharper than ever before. They had stopped the Serpents, taken down their operation, but the real battle was far from won. The Syndicate was a beast with many heads, and Jack knew that cutting off one would only make it grow stronger. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Jack said, his voice steady, yet filled with determination. "This isn't just about the Serpents anymore. The Syndicate runs everything. We need to dismantle them, piece by piece." Bear, standing beside him, gave a grunt of agreement. "We'll need more than just fists and guns to take them down. We'll need information, connections. We need to hit them where it hurts, under their skin, where it counts." Wrench nodded. "We can't go at this blindly. We need to know who's running the Syndicate, where their operations are, and how deep it goes." Jack turned to face his crew, a fire burning in his eyes. "We've already made a mark. We've already shown them that we're not afraid to stand up. But we need to take this to the next level. It's time to go after their real power. We're not leaving any stone unturned." The group exchanged looks, each member understanding the gravity of Jack's words. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting to protect the future, to stop a criminal organization that had infiltrated every level of society. Jack knew it wasn't going to be easy, and the stakes had never been higher. But the Iron Wolves had faced worse, and they had always come out on top. "Let's get to work," Jack said. With that, the bikers moved into action. They split into teams, each tasked with gathering information, making connections, and digging deeper into the web of the Syndicate's operations. Jack knew they had to be patient, that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. They were going to have to play the long game, but they were ready for it. As the days passed, the Iron Wolves made progress. They uncovered hidden connections, traced the Syndicate's network of influence, and found cracks in their armor. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized just how vast and entrenched the Syndicate's power truly was. It wasn't just about drugs, guns, or money. The Syndicate was involved in everything: politics, business, law enforcement. They controlled the system. Jack felt the weight of the task ahead, but he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. For Marcus, for Tyrone, for everyone who had been hurt by the Syndicate's corruption, they had to be stopped. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stood on the balcony of the clubhouse, looking out at the road ahead. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance signaled the arrival of more of his crew. They had made progress, but there was still more to do. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. "We've got the information we need," Jack said as the rest of the bikers gathered around him. "Now we hit them hard. We take down their financial operations first. Then we move on to their connections in the city. We won't stop until every last one of them is brought to justice." The bikers nodded in agreement. The plan was set. The Syndicate had no idea what was coming. As Jack looked around at his crew, he saw the same determination in their eyes. They were ready. The Iron Wolves had a reputation, one that had been earned through blood, sweat, and loyalty. They weren't going to let anyone threaten their world without facing the consequences. "We take this one step at a time," Jack said, "but we finish it together." The bikers mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life once again as they sped off into the night. Jack led the way, the road stretching ahead of them like a path of destiny. This was the final fight. The Syndicate had been warned. Now, it was time to end it. The Iron Wolves weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for justice, for the future, for everything they believed in. And nothing, no one, would stand in their way.